Chapter 8 of Soldiers, Part 1. A solid thunk roused Rarity from her sleep, her eyes fluttering open with a startled yelp. The carriage had fallen still at an odd angle. Her horn glowed as she pulled the nearest curtain back, squinting into the dawn sun, and poked her head out of the window set into the door. Onyx was frowning down at one of the wheels in the back. He looked up and dipped into an apologetic bow, revealing the bags under his eyes. "Apologies, Countess. The wheels broke."
"That's fine, dear. Oh my..."
She raised a hoof to cover her muzzle as a tremendous yawn passed over her.
How long until we can continue on?
"It'll be just a few minutes to swap in the spare, Countess. Do you may prefer to walk?" Rarity cocked her head as she followed the orange-clad soldier's outstretched hoof. A small hill overlooked the path, crowned by a narrow trench and surrounded by a collection of pale tents. A banner fluttered over the peak, the colors only just visible to the shadow cast by the sun. Yellow, with a bright red rooster in the center.
Yes, I think we'll manage on our own from here, Onyx. My sincere thanks for your service.
Rarity pulled her head back into the wagon, turning to see Fluttershy and Pinkie Pie rousing from their respective slumbers. It had been a hectic night after the nobles' conference. Whitehorn and Pontius had traveled forwards with Countess Silky, while Rarity and Pinkie had made their way back to Titus's estate with great haste to reunite with Fluttershy and pack appropriate provisions for an extended stay in Friesland. She had barely been able to keep her eyes open when they had left the estate again, even with the wagon bouncing and creaking underneath her. The nap she had stolen during the ride wasn't nearly enough.
"Is everything okay, Rarity?"
Fluttershy asked.
"Just a minor inconvenience, darling."
Rarity swung the wagon door open with her magic.
"Fortunately, it's a quick walk to our destination. I think it'd be nice to stretch our legs after so long cooped up, don't you?" "I know I do!"
Pinkie squealed in delight as she rolled out of the wagon, kicking up a small cloud of dust as she landed on her back in the dirt of the path. Rarity cringed back.
"Pinkie, be careful with that dirt!" "What?"
Pinkie whined, causing Onyx to whine beside her as he fetched her wheelchair.
"You're all the way up there!"
Fluttershy departed next, wings barely disturbing the drifting cloud as she alighted next to Pinkie and helped her up.
"You really should be more careful, Pinkie. Rarity works very hard on her dresses. It's not like she didn't bring spares."
Fluttershy yelped as Pinkie drew her into a tight hug, whispering loudly into her ear.
"Her trunk is full of dresses, Fluttershy. I don't know how she did it, but she squeezed her whole closet into it. A Rarity closet!"
Rarity smiled with pride as she gingerly stepped out onto the dirt road.
"Perhaps if you folded your clothes, you could do the same, darling."
Her horn glowed, floating the bags they had packed just a few hours previously and placing them snugly over their owners' respective backs. A few stray strands of confetti slipped out past the flap of Pinkie's bags, drawing an excited giggle from the pink mare as she strapped herself into her wheelchair. Next came the wardrobe trunk.
"Pinkie, dear, could you carry this for me?"
Rarity set her jaw, focusing on the carefully folded clothes inside the heavy tin chest. The carriage groaned in relief, rising up off the strained suspension as it was relieved of the weight.
"No problem, Rare Bear. Just took it onto my train."
Pinkie's smile was infectious, and Rarity couldn't help but match it with her own as she tied her trunk to the back of Rarity's chair with a knot of string. Pinkie started up the hill with a cheery hum, the trunk bouncing along behind her as she pronked up the slope. Rarity and Fluttershy followed at a more relaxed pace. The camp was all but bare of activity. Most of the motion came from the yellow banners fluttering in the breeze. Plain white tents were scattered around the foot of the hill in little groups of 3s and 4s, clustered around the smoldering embers of their fire pits as if seeking refuge from the biting wind. Rarity picked out Whitehorn waiting near the edge of the camp, exchanging a few words with the hawkish unicorn soldier. His ear twitched at the sound of Pinky's humming, and he turned to the trio with a smile. "Ah, Countess, Pinky, Fluttershy." He dipped into a quick bow. "It puts my heart at ease to see you all made it here in one piece." Fluttershy shot a nervous glance towards a group of passing soldiers, stepping closer to Rarity's side.
Why wouldn't we make it in one piece?
"You can never be too cautious when there are soldiers on the march," Whitehorn said. He turned to Rarity, and she was suddenly sharply aware of how she must look after the harrowing back-and-forth journey. "Pontius is breaking his fast with Countess Lécuyer right now. She extended an invitation for you to join them."
Oh, goodness, already? But I've just arrived.
Rarity raised a hoof to her name with a distressed titter.
And what of Pinky and Fluttershy?
"I'm afraid the Countess is not accustomed to dining with those of lower birth." Whitehorn raised a hoof to beckon Pinky and Fluttershy towards him. "I'll get them settled in, Countess. When did you intend to leave, if I might ask?"
Well, I would certainly hate to linger too long when there's a war to be stopped.
Rarity let out a theatrical sigh.
Where am I expected?
Countess Lécuyer's tent is on the crest of the hill, in the very center. You couldn't possibly miss it. Whitehorn dipped into another bow before turning away. "Come along, fillies. There's much to do." With a smile from Fluttershy and away from Pinky, Rarity was left alone among the tents with nothing but her thoughts and the gusting wind to accompany her. She glanced around, eyeing the few soldiers scattered around the otherwise empty camp. Some dipped their heads in respect, but most turned their stony gazes to the horizon. Raising a hoof to adjust the shade provided by her sun hat, Rarity strode up the hillside with a carefully measured gait. She had to make a brief detour upon reaching the trench at the top to cross a wooden plank that spanned the gap, the wood bending precariously under her weight. She looked down as she crossed, paled as she saw the sharpened stake staring back up at her, and sped into a hasty hop to the other side before stopping to recompose herself. It was just a short walk from there to the top of the hill, and the large square tent that commanded it. A pair of guards wearing bright red capes over their shoulders stood out front, and one poked his head inside to say a few words as she approached. The other held the tent flap open, lowering his eyes in respect. Smiling her thanks, Rarity stepped inside. Pontius and Countess Lécuyer were seated on cushions around a long, round table, laden with plates of steamed vegetables, cheese, and bread. Rolled-up maps were stored securely in a small scroll shelf in one corner next to a pair of closed trunks decorated with red lace. The back half of the tent was cordoned off from the front with a thin curtain, but the light streaming through the fabric made it easy to see the small bed and wardrobe behind it. Pontius was wearing his usual breastplate and orange tabard, while Lécuyer had put a wool coat on over the red tunic she'd been wearing previously. Both ponies looked up as Rarity entered. Pontius immediately rose up out of his seat, stepped to Rarity's side, and extended a wing to hover over her shoulder with a wide smile. "Countess Lécuyer, I present to you my wife, Countess Rarity." Inwardly, Rarity couldn't help but cringe. Outwardly, she put on a warm smile of her own and dipped into a perfect curtsy, the fringe of her white cloak draped over her shoulders hanging just off the floor.
A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Countess.
Countess Lécuyer stood to return both the curtsy and the smile.
So it is, lass. We can dispense with the titles if you don't mind. Just call me Lécuyer while we're among ourselves.
Rarity nodded.
And you may feel free to call me Rarity. I'm glad we have an understanding then. Take a seat, will you, before the food chills.
Rarity obliged, levitating a cushion to position a comfortable distance to Pontius before settling into place. He sat down as well, turning to Rarity. "Lécuyer and I were just discussing the siege." Rarity blinked.
Siege? Already? But I thought... Well, it's only been a day!
Lécuyer snorted.
Nay, not a siege yet. This is just the vanguard. The rest of the force shall take a week to assemble at least.
She paused, regarding Rarity with an appraising eye.
I hear ye intend to put a stop to it. That is the plan, yes.
Rarity's horn twinkled as she filled her plate as fast as was proper. It had been some time since she last ate, and she expected it might be even longer before she was given another opportunity.
I presume this displeases you? Nay, I wouldn't say displeasure is quite the word. My lands are the closest to Friesland, and most likely to burn if we're unable to break them. A quick surrender would be best for all parties, at least for now.
Rarity frowned but couldn't respond with her mouth full. She raised a hoof to signal that she had something to say, covering her muzzle as she swallowed.
How do you mean, for now? Surely that would be the end of it. Well, that's just it, isn't it? If the city has an army in its streets and a blade to Governor Ayer's neck, well, we take what we want and that's that.
Silky leaned forwards.
But if we're speaking of negotiations, then they've got a bit more to bargain with, eh? Suddenly, compromise becomes an option as much as the barons will hate it. Maybe they throw Nettlecus to the dogs after all in exchange for their continued independence, and they open their ports to whatever we please for a time. But that doesn't solve the matter. The city is still there, and in a few years, once the treaties expire and some other quarrel rears up, I'll be right back here drawing up the same lines.
She paused, leaning back with a wistful expression.
Though I'll be sure to get some more cannon in between. But why does there have to be another quarrel?
Rarity asked, gesturing with a hoof.
There's no reason you can't all get along.
Silky chuckled, reaching a hoof to give Pontius a good-natured shove.
Where'd your father find such a mare as this, lad? And gifted, too.
Pontius nodded with a tentative smile. She is certainly a remarkable mare. Silky turned back to face Rarity, who was watching her with a stern frown.
The barons in the city have been clashing ever since the first ships showed up, lass. When the last king fell, we were all so busy squabbling over who'd be the next one that we didn't even notice the city had become its own power until it started threatening to cut us off if we crossed it. That was generations ago, and it's only gotten stronger since. If we don't stop it, I figure eventually the governor will decide she's in charge of the whole island, and by then there won't be nothing to do but go along. Can't be more than a few decades off now. So if you don't defeat it decisively, then it'll take over the whole island,
Rarity said. She pursed her lips, frowning down at her plate.
Aye, now you're getting it. Maybe not every baron knows it yet, but one of us is gonna have to give in to the other in the end. And I don't think the winner's gonna give the loser a second chance. Or,
Rarity began, looking up to meet Silky's eyes.
a mare of proper manners teaches you how to live in peace. Ah, no worse than that Whitehorn lad.
Silky waved a hoof in the air with a scoff.
Idealist nonsense.
Rarity cocked her head.
You know Whitehorn? Of course I know him,
Silky snorted.
First time Siders sent him away empty-handed, he did some digging and came sweet-talking me next. The stallion's relentless. What did he want from you?
Rarity asked.
My help, Titus.
Silky smirked.
Old Soldier's still got a soft spot for me.
Rarity glanced towards Pontius, eyes wide. He had his eyes very intently focused on a hunk of bread on his plate.
So you're... Nay, lass, nothing like that.
Silky shook her head wistfully.
Just a few years of fun. Back before politics took over our lives. Ah, of course.
Unsure of what else to say, Rarity turned her attention back to her food. Countess Silky seemed content to sip at her drink and reminisce in silence, and Rarity saw no reason to interrupt, so she occupied herself by grabbing a long slice of bread from the middle of the table in her magic and applying a thin coating of butter. Not too much, of course, she had to watch her figure. So, conflict was inevitable, or so Silky believed. Surely there was some way the two sides could coexist in peace. These negotiations would be even more important than Rarity had thought. She would not have to just stop one war, but perhaps even find a way to stop them all. The boom of thunder rolled over the tent. Rarity looked up with a jump, seeing her own surprise reflected in Pontius's eyes as the plates, table, and even the ground under their hooves seemed to shudder in sympathy. Silky, however, let out a groan of exasperation. She raised a hoof to rub at her temple and shook her head.
Oh, that daft idiot! Goodness, that was unexpected.
Rarity let out a breathy titter.
The sky was still clear when I arrived. It's not thunder, I'm afraid.
Silky popped a square of cheese into her mouth and stood up, continuing to speak as she chewed.
That'll be the Frieslanders.
Rarity blinked.
The Frieslanders?
2 more booms joined the first in quick succession, knocking over Silky's mug and spilling its contents onto the ground.
Feel free to stay and eat your fill, Rarity. I expect I'll be needed.
She slipped out of the tent, drawing her wool coat closer as she turned into the wind. Rarity turned to Pontius.
Do you know what she means, darling?
Pontius's lips were set in a grin line. Aye, my lady. The Frieslanders are the name of the greatest mortars that defend the city. They must have just fired.
What?
Rarity shot out of her seat as her pace quickened.
Are we in danger? What of my friends?
Pontius stood up as well, raising a calming hoof. You need not worry. The camp is well outside of their range. Most likely they were just firing upon the vanguard in the field.
And we're sitting here eating bread and cheese?
Rarity scooped a daisy sandwich up in her magic as she stormed out of the tent, tearing half of it off in one bite and scanning the horizon. She hadn't realized it before, but the hillside gave an excellent view of the surrounding land. It was mostly open farmland, broken only by scattered hills, copses of trees, and simple cottages, with the high walls of Friesland dominating the horizon to the west. There was a flash of light from atop the wall, and the rumble of thunder followed a few seconds later. She looked down into the fields surrounding the city, where a group of ponies were running frantically towards the camp. She flinched at the sudden blast in their midst, throwing up thick clouds of dirt and... She gasped, falling onto her haunches as a hoof rose to her chest. Were those limbs flying through the air? The half-eaten sandwich fell to the ground beside her as a surge of bile threatened to eject her breakfast. Pontius came up beside her, his wings hovering just a few inches from his sides. My lady, we should make for our tent. We should be careful not to get in the way. Rarity barely heard him. She burst into motion, her carefully manicured hooves digging into the dirt as she leapt over the trench and down the hillside. Her mind was back in Titus's dining room, accompanied by the stench of blood. The fleeing soldiers swarmed into the camp in a rush, bringing with them the moans of their wounded. The red of their uniforms made it impossible to see the bloodstains as ponies were dragged into a long white tent towards the center of the camp, some of them missing limbs. Rarity caught Countess Silky in the middle of it all, exchanging heated words with a panting earth stallion, and she angled herself towards them.
Forgive him, Countess,
the soldier was saying, his head lowered.
The captain gave us the order to chase, Countess. Any right paid for it. Lost both legs in the first shot, Countess. Had to leave him behind. Idiot vultures and skirmishers into cannon range.
Silky swore, stomping her hooves.
Tartarus! Get your wounded seen to Sergeant and establish a picket with those that are able to walk. Did the Frieslanders give chase?
The sergeant shook his head.
They just about disappeared the instant we lost sight of them, Countess. Suppose it's too much to hope the commander on their side would be as fool as mine.
Silky grumbled.
You're dismissed for now, Sergeant.
She looked up as Rarity approached, fixing her with a commanding glare.
Countess Rarity, I'm afraid your needs will have to wait, whatever they may be. I must see to my ponies.
Rarity hesitated as she came to a stop, heart racing. The mare she faced now was a far cry from the one she had just eaten with.
I only wish to help, Countess. Where am I needed?
Silky arched a brow.
He ain't needed anywhere in here for certain. But surely the wounded, we have healers of our own, Silky snapped. I ain't the fool that marches to war with no accommodation for my troops. If you wish to lend aid, you can find the triage tent yourself, but if you wish to make a difference... She jerked her head west, towards the thin layer of trees that ran between the camp and the city. You go do your talking and leave the fighting to those that know how. Rarity stared open-mouthed as Silky marched away without even waiting for a response. After a few seconds, a pained scream from the triage tent shook her from her trance. She turned towards it just as Pontius caught up to her, breathing hard. My lady, please, come with me, darling! Rarity galloped towards the triage tent, bursting through the open entrance and into the chaos within. At least 24 soldiers were strewn about the tent, huddled up on soiled bedrolls while a few able-bodied healers rushed between them, shouting commands for healthy troops to fetch them water or alcohol or linens or tools. Fluttershy and Pinky were already among them, hunched over a green unicorn mare with a missing leg.
Oh, hold on, Night Rose.
Pinky had one of the mare's forelegs clutched in her own, holding her attention while Fluttershy worked on the severed stump.
And don't you worry, because you don't need 4 legs to dance. As long as you've got a tune inside you, you can dance with your heart.
Night Rose blinked slowly up at Pinky, her mouth hanging open in a faint frown, but said nothing. A piece of ripped cloth had been tied tight around her leg, slowing the bleeding to a trickle. Rarity skidded to a stop at Fluttershy's side.
Fluttershy! Pinky, how can I help, dears? Do you need me to fetch anything for you?
Fluttershy gave a slight shake of her head, but kept her eyes focused on the wound as she cleaned it with a dampened cloth.
That's okay, Rarity. Brownie is bringing my kit for me.
Rarity frowned.
Brownie?
It's what I named Shy's pet bear.
Pinky chirped.
Remember the little baby she found in the woods? She's brown and she's sweet and I just want to gobble her up. Ah!
It was at that moment that Rarity saw a bear cub stumble into the tent, its body almost completely hidden beneath Fluttershy's saddlebags. It waddled up to Fluttershy's side, settling down with a muffled grunt.
Thank you, Brownie,
Fluttershy said, reaching over to open one of the bags and pulling out a small jar. She popped it open with her mouth and dipped the tip of a primary in its contents, using the feather to dab the thick paste inside over the wound.
Just a little bit of this and then we can get a bandage on and take that nasty tourniquet off.
Rarity grimaced as she watched the wounded mare squirm and groan on the bedroll, in spite of Pinky's best attempts to distract her. Looking around, she saw a wounded stallion gasp out a haggard breath and fall still on his bedroll. A healer came by, checked the stallion's neck for a pulse, and barked some words to a pair of watching soldiers. Slowly, they bent down to pick the dead pony up and carry him out of the tent.
All of this pain, not only the first day.
Rarity's hooves kneaded at the ground. She desperately needed to do something, but Silky was right. She wouldn't be making a difference here. This was an army camp, and there was already a dedicated detachment of healers working to save lives. And they had no need of one more mare to fetch bandages or hold wounds. The tent was clogged with bodies as it was. The heat in the air was too much.
I'll be outside if you need me, girls.
The chill air outside the tent was sweet relief compared to the stuffy interior. Pontius and Whitehorn were standing a short distance from the open flap, and she turned to join them. Ah, Lady Rarity. Whitehorn dipped into a low bow. Is all well?
Nothing is well, darling,
Rarity said, looking west.
We should be in Friesland already.
Already? Surely some time to rest and plan can only do good, Whitehorn said. Pontius nodded. You must be exhausted after your travels last night, my lady. You should rest.
I won't be getting any sleep in this camp, that is for certain,
Rarity shot back.
Not when there are ponies dying a few steps away, and I'm not doing anything to help them.
Pontius and Whitehorn flinched back, The latter's eyes darted towards the triage tent as another body was hauled out, his lips set in a grim line. It is a dirty business, war. I admit I've never had much of a stomach for it myself. How is it looking in there?
Why don't you go see for yourself?
Rarity asked, curling her lip at him. Come to think of it, we already been during the surprise attack on Titus's estate. She shook her head, dislodging the distracting thought. She had to focus on what mattered.
I want to leave as soon as possible.
Whitehorn raised his hooves in surrender. Well, I certainly know better than to argue with you when you have that look on your face. Countess Silky's provided us with a white flag, but I'd advise you to give it an hour or two at least. Battle was just met, and it's best not to approach soldiers while their blood is still hot. Rarity nodded. As much as the waiting would kill her, it made sense.
Very well. We leave as soon as Fluttershy and Pinky are finished with the wounded.
She took a deep breath, forcing her racing heart to slow, and looked between him and Pontius.
Until then, I suppose we can spend some time discussing our approach. Useless.
Silence had always been a rare treat aboard the Argo. The ticking gears hidden behind the walls, the bursts of steam venting from the pipes, the rattling of the metal plating and the buzzing of the propellers had been Rainbow's constant companions for most of her time in the drowned future. They had annoyed her at first, but with time, she had come to find comfort in the staccato melody of the ship's song.
Why am I so useless?
But the ship was laughing at her now. She paced through the darkened halls, the pale starlight of the fading night mixing with the feeble yellow of dawn, before filtering through the passing windows and tight columns. The gears gossiped in her wake, sharing sinister jokes with the metal plating that nattered away under hoof. She approached a door, and the steam vented by its opening tickled at her ears. The door slammed shut behind her, steam hissing at her back as she stalked by.
I'll be fine, girls. Don't worry about me.
A few words exchanged, a heartfelt hug, and then they had climbed back into the submarine and made for the surface. Star Trails had made for the flight deck to plot a course to the frozen north, now known as the Gray, and Flintlock had been almost literally tugged to the medical room by Dusty Tome to have his burns examined. Sea Saber had spared her a firm nod before vanishing to wherever she had gone. Rainbow had walked with Applejack to the cargo hold to check on Luna, and then the cow pony had put her hat on and announced she felt like a half-strung hay bale before slipping into her quarters, leaving Rainbow alone with her thoughts. She had flown up to the top of the ship's balloon and run through her stances for hours. She had polished and oiled her wing blades almost to the point of damage. She had stood in the little supply closet where she had lost her eye, staring at the too-clean floor, where the faded brown stain was supposed to mark the panicked motions of her wings through her blood. Who had scrubbed it clean? It was past dawn now, and still she couldn't rest. She should be out in the open air, feathers catching the wind, speeding north with every pump of her wings. A door opened in front of her with the hiss of steam, and she found herself stepping onto the flight deck. Sunfeather was nowhere to be seen, but Star Trails looked up from where she stood on the control dais.
Oh, hey, Dash.
She smiled in greeting before turning her attention back to the controls.
You're up early.
Rainbow's tail flicked side to side behind her. She didn't feel like talking, but now she was trapped. Couldn't sleep.
Wow. Been up all night?
Trails chuckled as she shook her head, her navy blue mane sweeping over her shoulders.
Flint always crashes into bed and sleeps like a brick after a dive.
Rainbow realized she was clenching her jaw. She forced herself to take a deep breath, wings shuffling at her side as she stepped down to the lower level that held the controls.
What about you?
Trails didn't answer for a few seconds. She consulted a chart splayed out over several knobs besides her.
Well, I've always been one of Luna's children. I do my best work at night.
Rainbow nodded, but Trails was too busy with her work to notice. She seemed content to fiddle with the controls in silence, and Rainbow saw her opportunity to leave. She turned for the exit, but her hooves wouldn't move.
Why did you shoot Twilight?
She shook her head, her eyes squeezed tightly shut. She didn't want to talk. She wanted to be alone. But the question just kept bouncing around inside her head, louder and louder. Her wings twitched at her sides. She felt naked without her blades.
Why did you shoot Twilight?
She should leave it be. She couldn't leave it be. Rainbow Dash would never let harm come to one of her friends, and yet it would have happened anyways. She was in the ruins again, watching that murderous javelin fly for Twilight's heart. What would she have done if it had struck true?
Why did you shoot Twilight?
Rainbow blinked, startled by the sound of her own voice. She heard a sharp inhalation behind her and turned to see Trails looking at her with tired green eyes.
What do you mean?
You tried to shoot her!
Rainbow was in the other mare's face now. Her wings flared out. What was the point of all the training if she still couldn't protect the one she loved? Darkness crept into the corners of her vision as she raised a hoof and shoved Trails back.
You tried to kill her!
Trails stumbled back, raising her hooves in surrender.
It was an order, Dash! Saber doesn't give them lightly, and when she gives them, you follow.
She paused, before adding in a quieter voice.
That's just how it works.
That's how it works?
Rainbow spat. She slammed into Star Trails with a vicious snarl. The unicorn cried out as she was brought to the ground, flinching back as Rainbow screamed into her face.
You tried to kill my best friend!
Dash, stop!
Trails raised her forelegs in defense.
I didn't.
Let me show you how this works!
Rainbow's voice broke as she raised a hoof. Trails squirmed beneath her, but she was helpless underneath the pinning force of the Pegasus's beating wings.
Rainbow Dash, stand down!
The command wrapped around Rainbow's body like a vice, holding her back, and Trails seized the moment to kick her off and scramble back to her hooves. Rainbow blinked, the anger falling to confusion as she looked up to see Sea Saber frowning down at her.
Saber,
no! Saber stomped a hoof. I will not have you, nor anyone else, attacking my ponies on my ship! Rainbow shrunk back, wide-eyed under the sheer force behind the words. She'd been on the receiving end of Saber's shouted commands many times during her training, but this was different. She'd heard Saber be demanding, stern, even disappointed. But as she looked up into those fiery red eyes and the sharply angled brow above them, Rainbow realized that this was the first time she was seeing Saber angry. And Rainbow's own outrage rose to the challenge, her wings catching the heat in her chest and pushing her off the ground as she shouted back.
She attacked my friend!
She was following my orders,
Saber snarled, her wings flaring.
Twilight was a threat to my crew, and I don't take risks with their lives.
You think you're always right, don't you?
Rainbow shot back.
You can't stand the idea that you might have made a wrong choice! She was just trying to protect Spite and you tried to kill her for it!
Guys, chill!
Star Trails called out.
This is crazy! I'll handle this, Trails,
Saber said, keeping her glare on Rainbow. She took a deep breath, folding her wings at her side. When next she spoke, her voice was almost too quiet to hear.
You're right.
Rainbow frowned, hovering midair with her brow furrowed.
What?
I made a bad call, Rainbow,
Saber said, her eyes hard. I'm not perfect. I have to make quick decisions with what I know.
Well, looks like you two have this handled.
Star Trail said, slipping past Saber and towards the door.
I'll handle morning corrections after breakfast, boss. See you later.
With a hiss and a thud, the two Pegasi were left alone in the room. Rainbow's wings dropped at her sides as she slowly lost altitude, her hooves coming to rest against the floor. Without any resistance to rally against, the anger in her chest sputtered out, leaving only a cold emptiness behind.
I don't know what I would have done,
she said,
if she'd died.
Saber's eyes softened as she climbed down the steps to the lower level and placed a hoof on Rainbow's shoulder. I understand. I don't blame you.
How could you understand?
Rainbow asked. All she could think about was that moment in the dark depths of Canterlot, watching a javelin fly for her best friend's heart, every muscle burning with exertion and her mind racing to find some way to stop it. In the end, she hadn't been good enough. She might as well have not even been there. She bit her lip as a shudder ran through her body. Saber didn't say anything. The gears gossiped in the corners of Rainbow's ears, causing the floor to vibrate beneath her as if barely restraining a laugh. And yet she couldn't stop the words from flowing.
I wasn't tough enough to beat Gava. I'm not skilled enough to beat you. I wasn't fast enough to stop Star Trails every time one of my friends is in danger. I'm not good enough to save them. How could you ever understand that?
Rainbow looked towards the sun, clenching her jaw and surrendering to the burning in her eye.
You never make mistakes.
Saber let out a soft snort. I thought I was wrong to order the attack on Twilight?
No, you weren't.
Rainbow's voice cracked.
I wasn't even sure of it myself. I spent the whole dive up to that moment wondering if I'd have to save her from herself, you know?
She shook her head as her vision began to blur, tears dripping down both cheeks.
I was so close to doing it myself. But I would have been wrong. I came so close to killing my own best friend, and I hate myself for it.
It's not your fault, Saber said, squeezing her shoulder. Come on. I'm going to show you something. There was a part of Rainbow that bristled at the command in Saber's voice. The rest of her was exhausted, and was beginning to feel a creeping embarrassment. She took a deep breath as she blinked the tears away, straightening up.
Okay.
Saber beckoned with a wing, leading her out into the hall outside the flight deck, past the medical room, and to a nondescript door of thin metal by the top of the stairs that led down to the lower level. It opened with a soft click, the hinges swinging open without complaint.